On today with Jenna Ellis, a woman who needs no introduction. How are you today, Jenna?
I'm great. Thanks so much for having me, Adrian. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for joining me. So America's in the middle of an intense border crisis, which we've been for the last couple of years. This year alone, more than 2.7 million illegal aliens have come across the southern border. That's more than all 4 years of the Trump administration combined. So far, under the tenure of the Biden administration, there have been 5.5 million illegal aliens who have entered the country. In the state of Texas, they just declared an emergency in El Paso. At point, the case has moved to Greg Abbott is building a wall with shipping containers. They've actually used he's declared an invasion and stepped up his constitutional rights to defend the state from the border crisis in the absence of federal action on it. In your opinion, having served in a presidential administration with your legal background, what else can be done for states to be able to protect their borders since the Biden administration has made it such a low priority to do so at the federal level?
Yeah, well, there's no question that the Biden administration and Congress really are the ones that really need to step up, because Article 1, Section 8 specifically gives the Uniform Rule of Immigration and Naturalization to Congress to create those rules. And if Congress would step up and basically force the Biden administration to enforce that law, then that's really where the solution is. But of course, the Congress is more interested in infighting and other things in Washington than they really are about these concerns that all Americans share, especially those that live in border states. But even in my home state of Colorado, we're seeing a lot of that, I guess, influx from those border states that come into Colorado and all across America. And so what Greg Abbott has done is actually followed the Don Huffines plan. And if you go to Don Huffines' website, of course, some of you may recognize his name. He ran for governor against Greg Abbott in the primary. I supported him. I endorsed him. Unfortunately, it's really difficult when it's an incumbent, but he actually has a border plan for governors. He's worked closely with Kari Lake. Unfortunately, as we all know, she's in the midst of that appeal and probably not going to be a governor of Arizona. But what border states can do in the absence of the federal government enforcing the border and even the current laws that are on the books is that governors under the Constitution in Article 1, Section 10, they actually can declare an invasion and they can protect their border, and they can use the National Guard. They can use any other means that is available to the federal government to enforce their border if the federal government won't. So they don't have to just rely on the Biden administration. And if they're saying, too bad, we want an open border, the border state governors don't have to comply with that. They need to stand up and be more like Ron DeSantis and say, hey, I'm governor of my state. This is a border state. We're stopping this illegal influx of the border. We're closing the border. We're declaring an invasion, and we're going to enforce it.
So why do you think there's been such hesitation? I mean, Governor Ducey basically refused to do it. Governor Abbott didn't do it until after the election was over. Even now that he's putting up the makeshift border wall with shipping containers, I've seen reports from Rebel News that all that's happening is the Texas National Guard is now essentially setting up a checkpoint about a mile down where the cameras aren't. And just processing the migrants down there out of view of the public and still releasing them into the United States. So what is happening in these governor's offices, in the offices of these state and local officials, that they're too afraid to stand up and exercise their constitutional right to take action in the absence, again, of Congress or the federal government doing so?
Yeah, I would love to know, because they are so weak and spineless. I mean, that's what we saw not only in the 2020 election, that state legislators that were Republicans were unwilling to even look and address election integrity issues. We've seen governors that are Republicans be so weak and feckless to stand up to the federal government because they're either afraid to get sued, they are beholden to the National Republican Party that doesn't want to do anything about it, or they're simply afraid that the money from the federal government will stop. We need to reclaim state sovereignty and not be so beholden on federal handouts that we say, okay, well, basically the states are now compliant with whatever the federal government wants because we are exchanging our sovereignty for money. We need to be independent, free, sovereign states as our founders intended. That was the beauty of federalism, was to have a weak federal government and strong national sovereignty. And if Republicans were genuinely conservatives instead of Republicans in name only, they would recognize this, they would enforce it, and they would say, bring it on.
Right now, Title 42 is set to expire at some point. The case is moved to the Supreme Court. which is considering what it's going to do as far as that action. I know a lot of conservatives are concerned with Title 42 expiring because of the impact it's going to have on illegal immigration. It's likely going to cause the numbers to surge and exacerbate this crisis even worse than it is right now. But what's your take on Title 42?
Yeah, well, I mean, I share the conservatives' concerns that when Title 42 eventually does go away, and I think that the Supreme Court ultimately likely will hold in that position based on precedent and the fact that a current administration can't be bound by the executive action of a previous administration. If and when that does go away, then of course that will impact the border. But the problem for conservatives is that we need to be consistent. And so when we are using COVID as a pretext, I mean, the pandemic is over. We've all been saying it's over literally since 2020, right? And so to use COVID as a pretext to implement the outcome that we prefer on the border or to solve a problem that's not actually COVID related, we then are basically doing the same thing or advocating for the same thing as when we fought against COVID as a pretext to shut down schools or have mask mandates or vax mandates. And so this is what it means to genuinely be a conservative, not just a Republican. We can't just be outcome driven and manipulate the law however it suits us. We need to make sure that precedent is ultimately upheld. And if our government was functioning properly, we wouldn't need a COVID pretext to enforce the border. We would be telling our border governors to get their buns in gear and to say they need to enforce their own border. And so when we're looking at the 19 Republican attorneys general that are fighting for Title 42 to stay in place, then I think I'm going to be very interested to see what they actually argue at the Supreme Court, which oral arguments are set for February. And if the only rationale is, listen, this is helping against the surge of migration, that's really not a sufficient legal basis for precedent purposes. And Justice Gorsuch, in his dissent to the Supreme Court case the other day that held Title 42 in place temporarily, he basically said that. He said, listen, we're not policymakers of last resort. We are a court of law. He's absolutely right. But that needs to go for the Democrats and their policy as well as the Republicans and ours.
And I think a lot of people are quick to call out the inconsistency in terms of how Republicans and Democrats govern themselves. So, I mean, you're going to get some pushback, and we saw something like this a little earlier in the year with the Disney case. And there are a lot of people on the right who say, hey, once we have power, we should be willing to wield that power the same way Democrats do against our political opponents, because they're going to do it anyway. So what is there some sort of is there a damage that you see in maybe not taking what would someone call a quote unquote principled stand? I mean, there's sort of a rift between conservatives in what to do in situations like this, whether it's Title 42, whether it's other things. You know, what would your message be to people who just disagree with you on that?
Yeah, well, if we're not principled, then why are we even calling ourselves conservatives? And then we're no better than the Democrats. And ultimately, then we fall into a totalitarian society that whoever has the power in government can wield it absolutely. And we lose then our rights and our protections in a court of law to enforce the law justly and equitably in a court of law, regardless of the policy and the position. And so what I always like to tell my listeners is that when we're analyzing something for whether or not it's constitutionally viable, we aren't looking at whether we like the outcome or whether the government should do that or we prefer the outcome. We have to say, can the government do this action first? Is this constitutionally appropriate? If the answer to that is yes, then we can debate the policy should question all day. But if the government can't, then that's the end of the argument. And we as conservatives have to remain as a limited government, separating those powers and holding our government actors, Republicans and Democrats included, accountable to wield their powers in a limited and non-arbitrary fashion. Otherwise, we ultimately will then concede, like what Ron DeSantis did to Disney. A lot of people are very upset about the whole grooming situation. I am too. I don't agree with what Disney said at all. But what I do want to fight for is their right to say their own beliefs and their right to fight for legislation or against legislation in the state legislature like any other major corporation or individual. And so what I don't want to happen is then Governor Newsom go out and attack a Christian corporation in California for exercising their protected freedom of speech and their right to participate in state legislative action. And then we're basically deferring that, and we're saying we are going to ultimately have that principle then apply to something else. And if we're all just then debating, well, it's fine if Ron DeSantis does it because I like it, but it's not okay if Newsom does it because I don't, then we're not principled at all. We are only totalitarians, and that's exactly the opposite of what our founders intended and what conservatives stand for.